The room was supposed to be under his control. Every room was supposed to be under his control. That was the rule he had lived by for decades. He walked into that White House meeting knowing exactly who was across the table from him. He knew her name, he knew her face, he knew her reputation, and for a moment he probably believed this would be like every other moment in his life where he dominated the space simply by being present. But something went wrong that day. Something went very wrong. And what happened next would be replayed millions of times on phones, on news screens, on social media feeds, and in the minds of everyone who watched. What happened next was not supposed to happen. The man who always had the last word suddenly had no words at all. And the woman who everyone thought would crumble under his pressure turned the entire moment into something he could never take back. This is the story of the day Nancy Pelosi broke every rule he thought was unbreakable. Meeting had been arranged as a moment of unity, or at least that was the public story. The nation was watching, the cameras were waiting, and somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the understanding that this moment would define something important about who held power in that room. Pelosi walked in first. She had her composure, she had her purpose. She had done this for decades. She had sat across from presidents, prime ministers, and men who thought they were untouchable. She had survived them all. But this moment felt different. The air was heavier, the stakes were higher. And when Trump entered, she did not stand, she did not smile, she did not give him the satisfaction of a warm greeting, she simply looked at him. And in that look was something he did not expect. It was not anger, it was not fear, it was something far more dangerous. It was certainty. She looked at him the way someone looks at a storm they have seen before, and she was not impressed. The meeting collapsed almost immediately. By the time Pelosi walked out of the White House, something had shifted. The cameras caught her walking through the hallway with a quiet fire in her expression. She looked controlled, she looked focused, and she looked like a woman who had just made a decision that would change the entire political conversation of the week. She got into her car, she went back to Capitol Hill, and then she did something nobody was ready for. She stood in front of the cameras and she delivered 5 minutes of words that would go down in history as one of the most devastating public takedowns any political figure had ever delivered against a sitting president. She did not scream. She did not stumble. She did not give him a single opening to attack. She simply told the truth, and she told it with a precision that felt surgical. What she said that day was not improvised. Every word had been chosen, every pause had been placed for maximum impact. When she called him pathetic, the word landed like a hammer on stone, but it was not the word that made it so powerful. It was the way she said it, the way she let it sit in the silence before moving on, the way she did not flinch, the way she looked straight into the camera and made it clear that she was not speaking to the reporters in front of her. She was speaking to the nation. She was speaking to history, and she knew exactly what she was doing. When she called him weak, something changed in the room. Reporters who had seen countless press conferences suddenly felt the weight of what was happening. Some of them had been covering politics for decades. They had seen attacks, counterattacks, insults dressed as statements, and carefully crafted political warfare. But this was different. This was not an attack dressed as something else. This was a direct, surgical strike delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. And it was working. You could see it in their faces. You could see it in the silence that followed each sentence. You could see it in the way the reporters stopped typing for a moment and just listened. If you have never seen this moment, you need to watch it. Really watch it, not just the highlights, not just the clips. Watch the whole thing from the beginning and feel how it builds. Feel the control she has over every word. Feel how the tension never breaks. Feel how by the end you realize she never once raised her voice. She never once looked uncertain. She never once gave him an opening. That is what made it so devastating. That is what made it unforgettable. And then came the line that truly broke the internet that day. She said she believed what he said. She paused. She let the pause stretch. And then she delivered the knockout. She said she believed he was pathetic. The room went silent. The reporters froze. Some of them looked at each other in disbelief. Some of them looked at their cameras as if checking whether the audio was working, because what had just happened was not normal. This was not what press conferences were supposed to look like. This was not how opposition leaders were supposed to speak about a sitting president in the modern era. But there she was, calm, precise, and devastating. And the whole world was watching. When Trump walked out of that White House meeting, he looked rattled. Even his supporters would later acknowledge that something had gotten under his skin. He did not finish the meeting. He walked out early. He looked tense in the hallway. He looked like a man who had just been pushed into a corner he did not know how to escape from. And then, because he could not help himself, he did the thing that made everything worse. He went to the Rose Garden and held his own press conference. And in that press conference, he made a critical mistake. He tried to fight back. He tried to reframe the story. He tried to make her look small, but by the time he started talking, the narrative had already shifted. She had set the trap. She had delivered the blow, and now he was playing defense in a game she had already won. His response sounded desperate. It sounded like a man who had just been exposed and did not know how to recover. He called her sick. He said she was not a serious person. He tried to dismiss what she said by attacking her personally. But here is the thing about personal attacks without substance. They only work when the person delivering them is still perceived as strong. The moment that perception breaks, personal attacks sound like panic. And that is exactly what happened. Every word he said in that Rose Garden press conference made him look smaller. Every dismissive gesture made her look bigger. Every time he tried to laugh it off, the camera caught something in his eyes that looked nothing like confidence. And the public saw it. The public felt it. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. She stood tall. She spoke clearly. She used words that people understood, and that landed with emotional weight. She made everything about character, about truth, about the difference between strength and performance. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to insult his appearance or his intelligence or anything that would make her look petty. She simply drew a line between who he pretended to be and who he was, and she let the country decide for itself which side of that line he fell on. And when you give people a choice like that, when you make the comparison that clear, most people already know the answer before you finish asking the question. This is what powerful storytelling does. This is what effective political communication does at its absolute best. She did not give a policy speech. She did not quote statistics or cite legal precedents or walk through a list of accomplishments. She gave the country an emotional story about the difference between a man who was strong and a man who only pretended to be strong. And in that story, everyone watching could see the moment when his mask slipped. Everyone watching could feel the tension in the room when he walked out. Everyone watching could see the difference between someone who had nothing to prove and someone who was desperately trying to prove something that no longer felt real. There is a moment in that press conference where the camera catches Pelosi almost smiling. It is not a mean smile. It is not an aggressive smile. It is the kind of smile you see on the face of someone who knows they have already won the story, and they are simply letting the other side keep talking because it does not matter anymore. That smile, more than any word she said, told the country everything they needed to know about who had control in that moment. And that smile would become the image that defined the entire exchange. If you have been following political drama for any length of time, you know how rare it is for one moment to cut through all the noise and become something that lives in the cultural memory. This was one of those moments. Within hours, the clips were everywhere. The GIFs were everywhere. The screenshots of that almost smile were everywhere. People who had never paid attention to politics were suddenly sharing the video with their friends and family and writing comments that showed they understood exactly what had just happened. And that is the true measure of impact. When something transcends the political bubble and becomes a moment that regular people feel something about, that is when it matters beyond the headlines. But what makes this moment truly significant is not just the clip itself. It is the timing. It is the context. It is what led up to that moment and what came after it. This was happening in the middle of a national crisis. The country was facing multiple challenges that demanded leadership, and the people in charge were too busy fighting each other to provide it. That is the backdrop against which Pelosi delivered those 5 minutes. That is the weight that each word carried. She was not just making a statement about the meeting. She was making a statement about what kind of person was in charge of the country at its most vulnerable moment. And that is why it resonated so deeply with so many people. By the time she finished speaking, the story had already begun to shift. The morning had started with one narrative. The afternoon belonged to her. Every conversation, every talk show, every social media feed was suddenly about what she had said and what it meant. And the thing that made it so durable was that she had not said anything complicated. She had not made an argument that required a law degree to understand. She had simply described what she saw with her own eyes and let it speak for itself. And what she described was a man who could not handle the pressure of the moment. A man who crumbled when faced with direct confrontation. A man who talked big but walked away when things got difficult. And that description matched what millions of people had been feeling for years, but had never heard articulated so clearly by someone in a position of power. The fallout was immediate and intense. Trump allies rushed to defend him, but their defenses sounded hollow. They called her rude, dismissive, unprofessional, but those criticisms only made her point for her. because her response to his walking out was not emotional. It was not reckless. It was measured and precise and devastating. She had shown more discipline in 5 minutes than he had shown in the entire meeting, and every person who tried to defend him only highlighted that contrast further. The more they attacked her, the more obvious it became that they had no real response to what she had actually said. The media coverage that followed was unlike anything I have seen in modern political coverage. Pundits who had spent years defending one side or the other suddenly found themselves without a clear script. The moment did not fit neatly into the existing narratives. It was not a policy debate. It was not a partisan exchange. It was something more fundamental. It was a test of character, and one side had passed while the other had failed in real time. And everyone who watched it felt that difference even if they could not articulate it in the same way. But here is what is most important to understand about this moment. This was not an accident. This was not a slip. This was the product of decades of political experience, careful preparation, and a deep understanding of exactly how powerful words can be when delivered with the right timing and the right tone. Pelosi knew exactly what she was doing when she walked into that meeting. She knew what she was going to do if the meeting collapsed the way it did. She had prepared. She had thought about the words she would use. She had planned the pauses, the emphasis, the moment where she would let the word pathetic sit in the silence before moving on. And when the moment came, she executed perfectly. That level of preparation and control is rare in politics. Most political moments are reactive. Most statements are written by staff and edited and re-edited until they lose their edge. Most speakers are careful to avoid saying anything that could be used against them. But Pelosi did the opposite. She said exactly what she meant in the clearest possible way, and she trusted that the clarity of her words would be enough. And she was right. Because when you are dealing with a figure whose greatest vulnerability is the gap between his public persona and his private reality, the most powerful thing you can do is simply name that gap out loud and let the audience see it for themselves. This is the lesson that most political communication misses. People do not remember complicated arguments. They remember moments of emotional truth. They remember the feeling of watching someone say something that they have always known but never heard spoken aloud. And that is exactly what Pelosi gave the country that day. She gave them a moment of emotional truth. She gave them a moment where the pretense fell away and the reality underneath was visible to everyone. And that is why it still matters. That is why the clip still gets shared. That is why it is still used as a reference point in every conversation about political confrontation and power dynamics. The question that everyone was asking in the hours after the press conference was whether this would change anything. Would it shift polls? Would it change the narrative? Would it matter in the long run? And the honest answer is that it is complicated. It did not immediately change the political landscape. The people who already supported Trump found ways to dismiss it. The people who already opposed him found validation. But what it did was something more subtle and more durable. It gave people who had been on the fence a new framework for understanding what they were seeing. It gave them language. It gave them a way to talk about something they had felt but could not name. And in politics, giving people language is one of the most powerful gifts you can offer. Once they have the language, they can spread it. They can share it. They can make it part of the cultural conversation. And that is exactly what happened. If you are someone who enjoys political drama, you need to understand why this moment still resonates years later. It is not just because of what was said. It is because of what the moment revealed about the nature of power and how it works in the modern era. Power is not just about who has the most money or the most people on their side. Power is about who controls the story. And in that room that day, Pelosi controlled the story. She set the frame. She made the rules. She decided what the conversation would be about. And by the time Trump tried to respond, he was already playing catch-up in a game she had designed specifically to make him look exactly the way he looked. There is something almost poetic about the way it unfolded. The man who built his entire brand on strength and dominance and never backing down was confronted by a woman who did not try to overpower him. She simply refused to be impressed by him. She looked at him and saw what the country was learning to see. And when she named what she saw, everything shifted. The room changed. The narrative changed. And even though he tried to push back, tried to dismiss her, tried to reframe the story, he was already too late. The truth had been delivered. And once truth is delivered that clearly, it cannot be taken back. It can only be responded to. And his response only confirmed what she had already said. This is why this story still matters. This is why it is worth revisiting. This is why every time it gets shared, people who have seen it dozens of times still stop and watch again, because it is not just a political moment. It is a human moment. It is a moment about what happens when someone who has built their identity around being untouchable finally meets someone who refuses to pretend they are. And in that meeting, the truth comes out. And when the truth comes out, it changes things. Not everything, not permanently, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to remember. Enough to become part of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we value. If this kind of political drama keeps you watching, make sure you are subscribed. There is always more of this to come, and you do not want to miss the next moment that changes everything. The stories that shape our world are happening right now, and we are going to keep bringing them to you with the same level of detail and intensity that made this moment unforgettable. In the days that followed, the aftermath was fascinating to watch unfold. Trump allies scrambled to find a response that could neutralize what had happened, but nothing worked. Every defense they offered only dug the hole deeper. The more they tried to explain why he had walked out, the more it looked like they were admitting he had something to run from. The more they attacked her tone, the more obvious it became that they had no substance to counter her actual words. And the more they tried to change the subject, the more the country kept coming back to the same core image. A woman standing calm and certain, while a man who claimed to be the strongest person in the room fled from a meeting he could not control. Some people tried to spin the story in different directions. They said the meeting had been a setup. They said Pelosi had been looking for a reason to walk out. They said the whole thing was theater designed to create a moment she could exploit. But those arguments fell apart under basic scrutiny. Because if it was a setup, then it worked perfectly. If it was theater, then he was the one who provided the props. She did not force him to walk out. She did not make him look rattled in the hallway. She did not make him hold a desperate press conference in the Rose Garden trying to salvage something that was already gone. She simply described what happened, and he confirmed her description by the way he reacted to it. The press coverage over the following week was relentless. Every news channel replayed the clips. Every talk show discussed the implications. Every political analyst tried to explain what it meant for the broader landscape. And through all of that coverage, one thing remained constant. The clips of Pelosi were being shared more than the clips of his response. The image of her calm, precise delivery was being used more often than his desperate rebuttal. The word pathetic was being repeated everywhere, and every time it was repeated, it landed again. Because the word was not just an insult, it was a diagnosis. It was a description of a pattern that millions of people had been watching for years and finally heard someone name out loud in a position of real power. This is what makes political storytelling so powerful when it works. It is not about winning an argument in the moment. It is about planting a seed that keeps growing long after the moment has passed. And what Pelosi planted that day was a seed of doubt in the minds of people who had been willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. Not doubt about his policies or his politics, doubt about his character. Doubt about whether the person they had been watching on television was actually the person he claimed to be. And once that seed is planted, it is very hard to remove. Every mistake, every stumble, every moment of weakness that followed was filtered through the lens she had established. She had changed the question from whether you supported or opposed him to whether you believed he was the kind of person you wanted representing you. And that is a much harder question to answer with a simple yes or no. What is remarkable about this whole episode is how it revealed the gap between performance and substance. Trump was a master at performance. He understood how to dominate a room, how to control a narrative, how to make people feel like they were in the presence of something powerful and important. But performance only works when you do not have to actually perform under pressure. The moment the pressure became real, the cracks appeared, and Pelosi knew exactly how to apply that pressure. She did not do it through force. She did it through truth. She stood in front of a camera and told the country what she had seen, and the truth of her words cut through all the noise that had been built up around him for years. This is the lasting legacy of that 5-minute press conference. It showed that in a media environment that is constantly saturated with content, a single moment of genuine emotional clarity can still cut through everything. It showed that audiences are hungry for authenticity even when they claim to want entertainment. It showed that the gap between what powerful people present and what they actually are can be bridged in an instant by someone willing to simply describe what they see. And it showed that the most powerful weapon in political communication is not money or connections or platforms. It is the willingness to tell the truth in a way that people can feel and understand. And once you have that weapon, everything else becomes secondary. If you have made it this far in the story, you already understand why this moment still matters. You already feel the weight of what happened and why it became something that transcended the political news cycle and entered the cultural memory. And if you have thoughts about what happened that day, leave them in the comments. These conversations are important, and your perspective matters. We read every comment, and we want to know what you think about moments like this that define an era. Looking back at what happened, the most striking thing is how simple it all was. There were no complex strategies at play, no hidden conspiracies, no elaborate setups. Just a woman who decided she was done pretending, a man who could not handle being confronted with that truth, and a room full of cameras that captured everything. The simplicity of it is what makes it so powerful. Anyone can understand what happened. Anyone can feel what happened. And that accessibility is what made it travel so far beyond the political world and into the everyday consciousness of millions of people who do not usually care about political drama, but could not look away from this. The memory of that press conference still comes up in political discussions years later. It comes up when people talk about how to confront power. It comes up when people talk about the difference between strength and posturing. It comes up when people talk about the moments that defined an era. And in every single context, the same image returns. A woman standing in front of cameras, calm and certain, delivering words that cut through everything and refusing to flinch. That image has become more than a political moment. It has become a symbol of what it looks like when someone decides that the pretense has gone on long enough and chooses truth over safety. This is why we keep coming back to these moments. This is why they matter more than the daily news cycle and the partisan battles and the endless stream of content that fills our feeds and our screens. Because every now and then, something happens that reminds us what is really at stake in all of this. It is not about policies or polls or elections. It is about who we are as a people and what we expect from the people who represent us. And when someone stands up and names those expectations with clarity and courage, something shifts. Something becomes possible that was not possible before. And even if the shift is temporary, even if nothing changes in the immediate sense, the fact that it happened at all matters. The fact that we got to see it happen matters. And that is what we hold on to when we look back at days like this. Story does not end with the press conference, of course. The story never ends. There are consequences that follow. There are reactions that ripple outward. There are other moments that build on this one and change it and complicate it and make it richer and more interesting as time goes on. But the core of it remains, the 5 minutes, the word pathetic, the look in her eyes, the silence in the room after she said it, the way the whole country stopped and paid attention for just a moment to what had just happened. That moment is the heart of the story. Everything else is context. Everything else is background. But the moment itself is the thing that stays with you. And what it tells us is something we should never forget. It tells us that power is fragile. It tells us that performance has limits. It tells us that truth, when spoken clearly and delivered with confidence, can cut through everything we build around ourselves to protect our illusions. It tells us that the people who seem the most untouchable are often the most vulnerable to a moment of honest confrontation. And it tells us that sometimes the most powerful thing anyone can do is simply stand up, look at the camera, and say what they see. Because what they see might be exactly what the rest of us have been waiting to hear. This story will keep being told as long as people care about power and how it works and what happens when someone finally says out loud what everyone has been thinking. And as long as it keeps being told, it will carry the same impact it carried the first time, because the feelings it creates do not diminish with repetition. They deepen. They become more familiar and more meaningful the more we return to them. And that is the mark of a story that truly matters. It does not lose its power over time. It gains it. It becomes more relevant as the context around it changes, but the core human truth remains the same. If you have never watched the full press conference, I highly recommend finding it and watching every minute. Pay attention to her pauses. Pay attention to her tone. Pay attention to the way the room changes as she speaks. And ask yourself what it felt like to be in that room in that moment. Ask yourself what it would have been like to be one of the reporters watching this happen in real time. Ask yourself what it would have been like to be one of her staff watching their boss deliver the most watched statement of her career. The more you let yourself feel into that moment, the more you understand why it still matters. The more you understand why we keep coming back to it. The more you understand why some moments become bigger than the news cycle that produced them. And as you finish watching, remember that these moments are happening right now. Somewhere, someone is preparing for a confrontation. Somewhere, someone is building the courage to say something they have been holding back. Somewhere, someone is about to be surprised by their own strength in a moment they did not expect. The stories we tell about moments like this are not just about the past. They are about the possibility that exists in every present moment. They are about reminding ourselves that the power dynamics we think are fixed are often more fragile than they appear. And they are about celebrating the courage it takes to stand up and speak truth when silence would have been so much easier. So take this story with you. Carry it with you the next time you watch a political moment unfold and wonder what is really happening beneath the surface. Remember that the most powerful moments often look the simplest from the outside. Remember that the people who change the story are rarely the ones who are shouting the loudest. And remember that somewhere in the chaos of modern political life, there are still moments of genuine clarity that cut through everything and remind us what we really care about. This was one of those moments, and it will not be the last. Stay connected, stay curious, and never stop watching for the next moment that changes everything, because it will come. And when it does, you will want to be ready to see it for what it really is.